Salvete sodales! My name is Michael Waehner, and I'm the Latin teacher at Clear Falls High School in League City, south of Houston, Texas. You might recognize my name and school because I was supposed to be the JCL state host last year, or because I will be the state host this year if we can actually meet in person, fingers crossed. Or you might recognize me as the guy who writes the Prima Luce Latin children's books, which turn the classics canon into picture books suitable for very early Latin language learners. But I'm not here to talk about any of that, which is of course a Ciceronian praeteritio. I'm here to talk about how I've come to reckon with the concept of imperialism in my high school Latin class. I'm a secondary teacher, not an academic, but I hope what I've got here can serve as a jumping-off point for similar sorts of lessons or discussions in your classroom, be it middle school, high school, or post-secondary. I've put together a Google Drive of my materials for this unit, so if you want to steal anything I'm talking about, you can find it at tinyurl.com/TCA That's TCA and the beginning of my last name. So let me back up real quick and tell you about how I've structured my Latin 3 class this year. Inspired by some things I tried during the pandemic, I decided to mix up the order of the chapters of my textbook, which is the Cambridge Latin course, to create cohesive thematic units that would allow me to tackle some big issues with my students in a meaningful way. It's still a work in progress, but I'm really happy with how it's been going. I've had conversations about themes like these before in class, but making the themes our focus instead of a byproduct of our readings has helped my students to see the relevance in where I'm teaching them. My themes this year are colonialism, which I'm talking about today, social hierarchy, in which we'll talk about slaves, freedmen, lower classes, and upper classes, love and marriage, in which we'll be able to dig into gender studies, since most of the primary sources we have on the lives of women deal with that subject, and pietas, in which we can dive into a virtue that the Romans felt was important and hopefully find some more admirable behavior than in our other units. These other themes aren't really fleshed out yet. I've only just begun social hierarchy, but if you want to pick my brain or share ideas about any of the others, please feel free to reach out. Okay, so why colonialism specifically? Well, the current atmosphere, politically and socially, was a big motivator. In the renewed Black Lives Matter protests of the summer, the calls to decolonize our curricula have grown louder. Like most of you, I'm sure, I have always striven to make sure my class is a welcoming, non-racist space. But as recent calls have made many of us aware, we can't settle for simply being not racist. To right the wrongs of the past, we must be actively anti-racist. So what does this look like for a Latin teacher? I've seen good materials being shared online highlighting the ethnic diversity of the ancient Roman world and the contributions of classes of color to our field, which combat the notion of classics as being the sole purview of white people. These are important pieces of the puzzle, certainly, but they weren't enough for me. If you follow much of today's racism to its roots, you get to slavery, which is a problematic question for Latin classrooms and not my focus today, though it is certainly an area worth focusing on. If you follow slavery to its roots, you get to colonialism. This is true for ancient Roman slavery and for the transatlantic slave trade that created the structural racism of today. In a meaningful and unfortunate way, colonialism is at the heart of understanding modern history. And as a field, classics has a problematic history with colonialism. In the colonial era, the imperial powers looked to Rome as a blueprint. Rome was supposed to have been the good empire. And scholars of the time were all too happy to confirm that viewpoint. A good example is this quote by the British scholar James Bryce from 1914. "The success of the British, like that of the Roman administration in securing peace and good order, has been due to the high ideal of the duties of a rule which both nations have set before themselves." The assumption of classicists up until very recently has been that the Romans brought peace and civilization to their conquests, and thus that the Romans were somehow morally right to have made those conquests. By arguing, or at least by implying that, classicists cleared the way for others to argue that, for instance, the British Empire was doing India and Africa a favor by oppressing them. No serious scholar still holds such uncomplicated views about the moral righteousness of the British Empire, but all too often our curricula pass on a rosy, uncomplicated view of the Roman Empire, that the Romans brought peace, technology, and good government to some people that might have been before backward barbarians. Most of us Latin teachers as individuals have more complicated views, but the idealized Roman Empire is very much a force in any conversation about ancient history, and it is very easy for students to go through your average Latin course with that notion unchallenged. Decolonizing our curricula in a meaningful way means dismantling the myth of Rome as the good empire. It means making sure our students don't walk away from our classes believing that it could ever be morally correct to subjugate another people as the Romans did. So that became my mission in this first unit, to turn a critical eye to the Roman Empire as the precursor to the system that has created a host of modern injustices. Perhaps you are nervous about courting controversy and bringing politics into your classroom. I would encourage you not to equivocate on an anti-imperialist stance. It is not a political statement to assert that it is wrong for a stronger power to conquer and enslave a weaker one. If you are worried about discussing the application of this idea to American history in your classroom, then don't do that. Keep your discussions limited to ancient Rome and let the students draw their own connections. But your students need to learn about the harm that Rome's imperial policy caused, or they will fall into the trap of idealizing it. Remember the point made by Elie Wiesel and others. When it comes to the violation of human rights, silence and neutrality always help the oppressor, never the oppressed. If we don't talk about this in class, many of our students will never question the skewed messages that our often pro-imperialist culture sends them. A quick word about terminology. When I first started working on this unit, I was using the term imperialism instead of colonialism. Imperialism and colonialism are modern terms, not ancient ones, and they're so close to synonymous that for the purposes of applying them backward to Rome, there might as well be no distinction. I landed on colonialism as the most applicable term, but I sometimes use the word imperialism in this presentation and in my materials. I did film a quick introduction to the concept of colonialism for my class when it was meeting asynchronously, so I've included that video introduction in the Google Drive. You may use it for your classes if you're so inclined. I gave it to my students in the middle of this unit, not the beginning, but it really could go anywhere. So those are my philosophical underpinnings, which I think are important enough to dwell on, but I might be preaching to the choir. So let me get on to how I brought out this theme in my Latin 3 class this year. My readings are largely Cambridge or Cambridge influence with a bit of AP syllabus sprinkled in. If you use a different textbook or a different system entirely, I do think you can still draw some inspiration from how I've structured my unit and the questions I've put to my students. I think replacing all my textbook readings with authentic texts could work quite well in a high-level class. Step 1 for me was reviewing the introduction of General Agricola in Unit 3 of Cambridge. My Latin 3s had already covered this, but in quarantine, so they remembered nothing about it because they were also experiencing the opening stages of a worldwide trauma. So I thought it would be better to repeat this as if they had never read it before. Agricola first shows up in a short story on stage 26, Adventus Agricolae, in which he is adored by his troops. It made for a great review of subjunctive clause types and a brief discussion of Agricola's reputation. Then we read an abridged version of Tacitus's biography of Agricola in the English translation freely available online. I've put all the files for the excerpts I used in the Google Drive so you can steal them. My focus in part 1 is on his career in Britain, the respect and adoration Tacitus shows him receiving, and his famous Romanization of the British people, convincing them to build bathhouses and wear togas, winning hearts and minds and such. Next, we reread the model sentences for stage 28, which show Salvius taking the opposite tactic with the British, ruling by force and burning and pillaging. It sets up a nice contrast, and we talk about the differences between their leadership styles, how conquering with culture works better than by force. If this is sounding too pro-imperialist for you, then you're way ahead of me. Don't worry, I'm laying a trap. Our last step in our review was to reread the culture readings about Britain from the beginnings of the Blue Book, and have a brief discussion board debate, because we were still asynchronous, about the pros and cons of the Roman occupation of Britain. Full directions for that can be found in the Google Drive if you're interested. Step 2 was stage 37 in Unit 4, about Domitian's council, the Amici Principes. For the uninitiated, these stories deal with Agricola asking Domitian to expand his war from Scotland over to Ireland, and Domitian's council arguing over whether Agricola was getting too powerful and becoming a threat to the emperor. It's all heavily indebted to Tacitus's Agricola. Stage 37 was a big jump for my students. The latest stage they'd been exposed to previously was 30. My colleague Shelley McCormick-Lane and I designed assignments carefully, structuring them to ask about comprehension and the grammar that they could understand, and not worrying about the things that would escape them. Shelley made tiered, simplified versions of many of the stories for them to read before approaching the full versions, and I've put those in the Google Drive too. Between stories, we had brief group discussions, usually about 5 minutes, maybe 10 or 15 if I decided to make them pull a quote to back up their answer. My questions in this stage were, how do the senators feel about Domitian? What are the priorities of the senators advising Domitian? What are Domitian's priorities when it comes to Britain? And what are the Romans' priorities when making decisions about Britain? These many discussions were an important facet of this unit, and I played as Socratic a role as I could. I asked the initial question, and I threw in clarifying questions from time to time, but I avoided making any points myself. Once they got warmed up, my students really took to it. They said most of what I'd have wanted to say, and plenty that I'd never have thought of. Now, I was pursuing a sneaky goal here. As I said, I was laying a trap. I wanted students to get into the weeds of Roman politics. I let them focus on Domitian as a bad leader and Agricola as a good one, and we talked about why. That Domitian, at least as portrayed in Cambridge and by Tacitus, was self-centered and obsessed with power. We talked about how Domitian didn't really care about the Britons, even as he makes decisions about them. Stage 37 ends on a cliffhanger. We don't know what decision Domitian made or what happened to Agricola, and Cambridge never tells us. So at this point I inserted excerpts from the end of Tacitus's Agricola, detailing Domitian's intentional sidelining of Agricola due to jealousy, and Agricola's death in relative obscurity. We lamented that the bad emperor destroyed the career of the good general, just as Tacitus would have wanted us to, because I haven't come to my point yet. Step 3 was to return to the Masada stories of stage 29. For the uninitiated, these are very good stories that come with big trigger warnings. They detail the suicides of the desperate Jewish rebels in the fortress of Masada Rock just before the Romans were about to take them prisoner, as told in Josephus's Jewish War. In the wholly fictional part of the stories, the last surviving sons of the rebels imitate them by killing themselves years later at the ceremony where Domitian is dedicating the Arch of Titus. I have always found these stories difficult to do justice to. It's a brutal arc. We deal with the touchy subject of a Roman genocide practiced upon the Jews for half a stage, and then in the next stage we switch to a Roman contractor hoping for his reward for helping build the Arch of Titus. The Masada stories are good, but they're so much weightier than their context, and since I usually hit them at the very end of Latin 2 when the year is winding down, I often just skip them. If the students can't get in the properly serious headspace, I'd rather not discuss genocide at all. So I hadn't done the Masada stories with this group yet at all. In this new colonialism unit, I've finally found the proper context for these stories. When placed directly after a discussion of the methods and reasons of Roman conquest, these stories provide a visceral and unforgettable picture of what a Roman conquest did to the lives of conquered people. As a direct result of politicians bickering behind the scenes about petty concerns of power, real people are having their lives destroyed, having to choose between death or slavery. In past years, these stories have often left students feeling very emotional, and though we discussed these emotions, there was no place for their grief to go. This unit gave them a direction for their grief. Instead of a sad feeling that the whole world is unjust, we were left with a system to point to and say, this is unjust. Roman colonialism created this human tragedy. Plugging this story into the context of colonialism gave us a way to turn grief into meaning. The discussion after these stories was heavy and really productive. Though I continued to largely teach with my mouth shut, I provided some nudges when students started to place the blame at the feet of the emperor personally. Was it a single emperor? How many emperors were involved in the conquest of Judea? This problem was bigger than any individual. It was systematic. At this point, I started to talk about post-colonialism, the historical practice of correcting for the old adage of history being written by the victors. I started to ask them to apply what they learned from Masada to Britain as well. We turned back to Tacitus's Agricola, still in English, and read a passage I'd left out of our earlier readings, Colgaucus's speech to his Caledonian soldiers, which contains the memorable phrase, "They make a wasteland and call it peace." Such a succinct and spot-on condemnation of the Roman Empire. Agricola's speech right afterward falls flat in comparison. The discussion about which side is morally right is extremely short. The more interesting discussion was about the fact that it was probably Tacitus who made up the whole speech. Is this Tacitus's inner doubts about the justness of Roman rule coming out? Is this a case of a writer writing his villains' motivations so well that they're more convincing than his heroes? There's no answer, and that was a neat discussion. Next, we read 2 whole sentences of Caesar 4.35, part of Caesar's invasion of Britain. I've included the PowerPoint slide I used in the Google Drive. This has always stuck out to me when I was teaching AP, how Caesar relegates killing many enemies to a subordinate clause and burning all of their buildings far and wide to an ablative absolute, how Caesar's dry style pulls focus away from the human toll of his wars. He sanitizes his accounts not by removing the human cost, but by describing it in such abstract terms that the reader has to work to remind themselves that we're talking about people's lives. Dehumanization by bureaucracy. I could see using any number of excerpts from Caesar here, but this unit was already a little too long, so we just looked at this very brief excerpt. I'd love to hear from you about this. What parts of Caesar's writing do you think would go best in a unit about colonialism? Finally, we read the fable of Phaedrus from stage 42, about the wolf and the lamb. The theme of this fable goes well with colonialism, because it's all about people who make up righteous-sounding reasons to justify the bad things that they would have done anyway. Of course, it's an adaptation of Aesop, who would not have felt this way about the Romans, because the Romans weren't really the Romans yet in his time. And Phaedrus probably also did not apply this theme to the state he lived in, but it works well for us as modern observers, and it puts a nice cap on the unit. I was a little nervous about it because this was my Latin 3's first exposure to poetry, but they didn't find it difficult at all, actually, so I'll consider it a nice confidence builder before we get to the more challenging poetry. Before I get to the final paper I used to wrap up the unit, let me talk about a little bit about how you might sub out the Cambridge readings for authentic texts, if that's the sort of class you are teaching. My feeling is that you could make this unit work by starting with any set of readings that address the political concerns behind Roman conquest, then transitioning to readings that address the realities of Roman treatment of their provinces. So for works about conquest, I'd certainly point to Caesar's Gallic Wars and Tacitus' Agricola, which you could read in Latin instead of the English I used. You could also likely find good material in many histories that touch on war, such as Polybius, Cassius Dio, or Florus. I don't have specific ideas about those yet, though. Works that bring out Roman treatment of conquered people are harder to come by. The story of Masada from Josephus is in Greek, not Latin. Perhaps you can use a translation, or maybe you're teaching students who know Greek, I don't know. For a Latin source, what jumps to mind is Cicero's In Verem, in which he prosecutes Verres for exploiting his province. If I remember correctly, not only do you get a great first-hand account of the lengths this one rapacious Roman goes to get rich off of his province, but you also get Cicero citing examples of other governors who similarly abused their power. I'm also giving you the citation for a book I found on JSTOR, Roman Empire, The Roots of Imperialism by Neville Morley. I haven't read the entire book yet, though I plan to. I read Chapter 2 when researching this unit, and I found it to be a clear-headed introduction to the modern problem of applying anti-imperialism to our study of ancient Rome. I didn't have my students read directly from this book, I merely passed on ideas and used it for the underpinnings of the unit, but there could be a lot of value in getting students to interact directly with this secondary text. These are just the things that occur to me. My education on this subject is nowhere near complete yet, and I'd love to hear if you have suggestions for primary or secondary sources that would fit well in this unit. For assessment in this unit, I used many of the same small story-based assignments that I would in any unit. We've done plenty of vocabulary review, and I could see giving vocabulary quizzes in another year, though this year with the hybrid education models and all, I, like many of you, have moved away from vocabulary quizzes in the traditional mode. But my main assessment for the unit was a final writing assignment. I did an assignment halfway through the unit gearing up for the final paper, which asked them to find quotes but not to write a full analysis yet, and that's in the Google Drive. For the final paper itself, I kept the prompt broad to encourage different lines of thought from different students. Here's the intro to the assignment. I won't get into the full nitty-gritty of it because it's there on the Google Drive for you to modify or steal at your leisure. On the day I assigned the paper, I posed the questions on this assignment sheet, and we had one last spirited class discussion. I encouraged them to speak freely and take notes, and to use ideas from the discussion in their papers. This was pre-writing. They were shocked to hear that they didn't have to hoard their good ideas for themselves, and that in college this is exactly how we write papers, by honing and expanding on ideas others might have brought up in class. In this final discussion, I did take a moment to show the "What have the Romans ever done for us" scene from Monty Python's Life of Brian, and we had a well-educated chuckle about it. I thought my students did an amazing job with these papers. It was their first lengthy writing assignment for me, so they weren't the most refined papers I've ever graded, but they showed real engagement with the issues. Here are some quotations that I pulled directly from student papers, presented warts and all. While these acts are portrayed as good, Agricola's attempts to spread Roman customs and culture were just examples of the conquerors imposing their culture on the conquered. While Agricola makes it sound like he simply talked them into this change, the Britons probably thought that they had little choice. I liked the nuance that the student brought into the traditional view that the Romans brought good things to the people they conquered. The positive effects of Roman invasions on less advanced societies are well known to many. But those who reflect often create a balancing act between the pros and cons, as if the damage done to the conquered does not utterly outweigh any benefits. This balancing act is largely performed by the party who lost nothing. This student highlights the same nuance as the first quote and expands on it by pointing out that it's never the people who are on the losing end of history who get to decide what the costs and benefits of the conquest were. And then those who look to Rome as a guide cannot only assume its guidance on political and technical innovation, but must also reflect on its destructive and all-powerful approach to expanding its reach, which would often leave infrastructures and cultures utterly decimated in its path. I liked this student's moral stand in insisting that we look at every aspect of Roman conquest rather than cherry-picking the parts we like. In summation, this unit exceeded my expectations. I felt that it engaged my students' critical thinking skills, exposed my students to larger issues on the study of ancient history and the classics, and encouraged my students to question larger power structures. My students found it more meaningful than a typical unit in my old Latin 3 classes because they saw the relevance of the discussions we were having to their own lives and their place in the world. Parallels with America often came up in class, and I let them talk about that, though I did nudge them back toward Rome if I was worried it was getting too politically charged. I think I have done a portion of the work needed to decolonize my Latin 3 curriculum, and I certainly wound up with an engaging first quarter. I can't wait to unleash this group on Caesar next year. This will conclude my video presentation, which is a totally weird way to present and robs me of the opportunity to hear your thoughts and reactions immediately. So please, if you have done similar things, or if you want to try out something similar, or if you have ideas for augments or replacements or things I'm just wrong about, shoot me an email. Our community of sharing ideas is a valuable thing to me, and I'd like to keep it going even without us meeting in person this year. Thank you very much.